Welcome everyone to DLIS Let's Talk Librarians Respond to COVID-19 webinar series. Today we're going to be talking about the provision of remote services for older adults with some of our friends from the Brooklyn Public Library. I just want to take a moment to thank you all for tuning in and remind you to please keep your microphones muted. Speakers, you can go ahead and unmute yourselves, and we'll get started with the discussion momentarily. As I warned people who were in the room about 5 minutes ago, New York City is experiencing some pretty severe weather right now, and in the event that our telecommunications infrastructure gets knocked out and connections, please remember that you'll get a follow-up email if the event just shuts down suddenly. It's because of the weather. So bear with us and keep your fingers crossed while we continue. So today's speakers, we're going to be hearing from Lyman Claiborne, who's the coordinator of older adult services for Brooklyn Public Library, and Taina Evans, who's a regional manager at Brooklyn Public, but has also spent some years dedicated in that office of older adult services. So welcome, speakers. If you could just give me a mic check, say hello.
Hello, my name is Taina.
Hi, Taina. Welcome.
Hi, this is Lyman.
All right, looks like we're good to go. So let's talk a little bit at first about what I'm calling before the flood, which is the period of work before our shutdown that began for some of us in the middle of March. Lyman, what was the service model for Brooklyn's provision of services to older adults? It looks like it was mostly in person, right? This photo was taken from the Brooklyn Library's blog.
That was from the Fiesta Senior Center.
Yes, that is correct. Most everything was in person. We did, though, have a books by mail program that services about 495 people. But that too was halted due to the pandemic because we did not have staff at the actual facilities sending out the mail. Um, Other in-person programs that we had were our creative aging programs, and we also had um, just mainly everything would be teachers going out and presenting crafts, arts, and workshops. So yes, everything was mostly in person. Um, I myself was with New York Public Library for about 6 years with older adults and services for the blind and visually impaired, and literally was at this position for 6 days before we had to close. So Taina was my predecessor, and she has advanced on into Brooklyn um, public service. So if I defer to her today, you'll know that it's because she's had so many years in this position, and I had literally had 6 days before we had to shut down.
Yeah. Mhm.
No, go ahead. I was just going to invite you to give your 2 cents on what the models were like before the shutdown.
Right. So, as Lyman mentioned, we had a books by mail program. Well, we continuously had a books by mail program. So, services for older adults, the department itself launched in 1974. So, we literally had 40 years, over 40 years of experience of providing services, particularly to the largest demographic in New York State is older adults that reside right here in Brooklyn. Queens actually have the second highest amount of older adults, and then Nassau County and Suffolk County have actually seen an increase. So the entire state of New York have seen an increase of older adult population. And so right before the flood, we were at this peak point where we had an aging boom within the state. So the library was in a position to kind of expand services in what we affectionately call vulnerable communities, but we really wanted to just target the 50 plus audience. Now I know RUSA just released some guidelines, and the OLOS, the Office of Diversity and Outreach, about 60 plus as the audience, the target audience. But the Department for the Aging, the New York City Department for the Aging, AARP, and Brooklyn Public Library, and I think Queens as well, we all define our older adults as the 50 plus audience. And what that looked like was expanded service in senior centers. So we had our senior assistants that go out and did programs at nursing homes and at senior centers. The Books by Mail program that Lyman was talking about began in 1974, and our Words and Memory program, in where we kind of allow older adults to in an edifying way share their personal stories and to kind of spark a conversation group. That also began in the 1980s. And then our depository collection at nursing homes, which currently stands at over 142 senior sites, that also began in 1974. So we had like transactional services that were long standings, but some of the recent services was creative aging workshop, which this picture is actually from, which is hilarious. And that's where we, hired teaching artists that would go in person to the centers, to the branches, to conduct artist-led programs. That could be watercoloring, that could be photography, that could be acrylic and design. We try to launch one with participants who had memory loss or Alzheimer's. We had virtual bowling programs within our locations, computer classes that were aimed for older adults, and we had financial workshops for those who want to start a business after 50, and also individuals who are getting back into the workforce after retirement. Given that we are in a city that is quite expensive and the cost of living is high, a lot of older adults were looking for alternatives, and they turned to the library to access our resources. And of course, providing readers advisory to individuals who really wanted access to our collection exclusively for those individuals who were homebound and physically unable to get to our doors.
So you were kind of, I guess, in the process of maybe increasing your services because of the increase in population. Uh, was this something on the radar at all, like an immediate shutdown? I know it took a lot of people by surprise, but what kind of contingency plan did you see at Brooklyn in regard to providing services to older adults?
It wasn't on the radar. I mean, and just from my new position, we, from what we knew that the mayor had a plan, and he kind of had a conversation with our CEO, and it went back and forth with some of the other three library systems. And New York Public closed first, and so what Brooklyn, I think, what was agreement with Queens was to do is just to kind of modify services, limit hours. But after a while, it started to be a resounding chord that maybe closing would have been the best thing. Lyman, you were like 6 days in. What was it like on the outreach end?
So we were really scrambling the last couple of days to get all the significant staff a laptop. Because if you want to talk about any planning, that's probably about all that we were able to rush and do in the last couple of days. So thankfully, we've gotten that into our main staff's hands. Just get everyone a laptop. But no, we really did not have anything set into place for this kind of long shutdown. I mean, there had been obviously hurricanes in the past and things like that, but nothing of this magnitude. It's really having us to totally rethink the needs of our patrons and the capabilities of our staff.
Which brings us to what exactly are you doing right now? What are the operating motives? You've sent me this flyer, which is great, that lists essentially, I think you've moved some of those in-person programs, whatever could be transferred,
Right.
into a synchronous online event, and that includes a scrapbooking workshop, a story writing workshop. I think that was probably what Taina mentioned as words and memory, and then this movement and play workshop, which sounds fascinating to me, and then an oral history project that looks to have been ongoing. So, what was involved in transitioning these services, these programs, into virtual from physical?
So, first of all, we had to obviously all staff learn about Zoom and learn about a platform to convey these programs. Second of all, we had to find instructors that either had some sort of experience with virtual programming or with the Zoom, or if they didn't, someone that we felt comfortable after vetting that could present these programs virtually, and which really took extensive phone calls on my part and a lot of questions, um, a lot of who, what, when, where, why. And then we had to actually do all of our contracting process that we normally would do um, in the office. We had to do everything coordinating through finance, through contracting, from home, basically, the whole process. Um, and then we had to work out just the logistic technical items, such as am I going to be present during the Zoom? Are we going to limit registration so we don't have people Zoom bombing? We had to really figure out exactly what this is going to look like. So that was just maybe some of the nuts and bolts of it. Another thing that there's really not a flyer that I could send you, but I did want to mention that we've started. So we reached out to our books by mail patrons that are registered. I had a couple of my staff members making phone calls, and what we were doing was trying to see if any of the older adults were interested in a weekly wellness call, almost like a telephone buddy. And so far, we've gotten response from about 10 to 12 of the seniors that are interested. And what that means is we're starting out with the first 8 of those folks calling one another weekly to just check up on one another, do a wellness, do a little bit of socializing. And then we've had 26 to 30 Brooklyn Public Library staff reach out to me and say that they're willing to also do calls such as that. So that's something that management has really been interested in me pushing, so that we can just at least reach out to our books by mail patrons and maybe offer them resources if they ask about food or housing. Not extreme social work, but at least have resources available for staff to tell them about. But it's mainly just a weekly checkup, wellness, and socializing.
And ideally, that's kind of like social, flattening the social isolation within older adults, right? So they're ideally a vulnerable population in the sense that our homebound patrons are typically isolated. And now that everybody has been in a setting where they have to work remotely and they have to now identify which grocery store they're going to deliver to their homes, or what services that they could kind of have at their fingertips or at their disposal, kind of like everyone else. It's good to do those wellness checks, and it's and also good to stay connected for everyone.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
One
I
of the
know of
things
other
that I've read.
libraries who have, sorry, I know of other libraries who have tried different aspects, and they've, for instance, I know one library who was told its clerical staff to reach out to homebound patrons and use, I don't know if you remember, *67 to block your personal
Block the
number.
number.
Yeah, and it's funny because, you've got a younger clerical staff that were like, "What's a star 6-7?" And it's like, "Oh, yeah, we remember this stuff from, 20 years ago." So that's great that you guys are doing that. I would imagine that, you're making an impact. I love the idea of actually connecting the patrons so that they can socialize on their own and build relationships, and then maybe if they knew each other before in person, maybe they'll start an in-person relationship when this is all over. So that's a wonderful thing.
It also helps for the future if you decide. I actually was on a call today, um, pursuing the thought of a virtual book club. And so that also helps too, because if you have patrons that are already socializing amongst themselves, they may be more eager to join your programs if they say, oh, well, so and so is going to do that too. I think I'll join as well. So you're actually trying to create a built in audience as well for your programs.
I also wanted to talk about um, another oral history project. So the oral history flyer that you're looking at right now is led by a teaching artist, teaching an older adult how to the process of oral history and working through sequential based learning modules about how to build that out. But the department that Lyman manages also managed an oral history project called Our Streets, Our Stories, and because we have a podcaster on hand, her name is Virginia Marshall, she's taken the lead in kind of collecting Brooklyn COVID-19 stories. So originally, Our Streets, Our Stories lend itself to older adults because they were in a position to kind of tell the changes that happen through the culture neighborhood. And so thinking a subset of that is to kind of just collect Brooklyn COVID stories, and we're working with a lot of archivists throughout the country and adding and building onto a database to find out, if any of the changing, if any perspective have changed under this pandemic, what the future Brooklynites can understand, what do they should know on a local level. And I can send or put in the chat the link to that on our website. But that's something that we're also starting up. I know I'm going to be leading a training for volunteers who are interested in kind of going out and making those calls uh, for their neighbors, particularly those who are older adults and who were kind of marginalized in all of this.
I think one thing that Taina and I have mentioned, just even amongst ourselves, is this is kind of for us almost stripping it back to basics. I mean, you hear us talking a lot about the telephone, so it's almost like we're going back to just the ground zero basics of calling people on the telephone, thinking about having book clubs or checkups that just involve the telephone. Um, I think the reason I'm really concerned is I believe in this time our definition of free access for all is being stretched because um, a lot of these programs that we're talking about virtually, there's a built in uh, acceptance that the senior already knows how to use Zoom or the computer. And this is not true, really, of a lot of our older adults. And so I think Taina and I have been thinking about how sometimes this virtual programming may be limiting the access to our older adults and just trying to think how we can include more older adults during this time without having to go really sophisticated on the technology.
Yeah, and part of that we're doing as well is Lyman just added a piece to the Center for Urban Libraries Future research supporting older adults through coronavirus, ideas from experts and leaders across NYC. I can also send a link to that. And really working with community partners to spread awareness of, not only of what the library is doing, but what other city agencies are doing to kind of reach out to the older adults in a myriad of ways so that they can get the information that they need, whether it's assistance to another agency, whether it's social work, whether it's wellness, whether it's library materials, e-library cards. So it's really a collective in New York City working towards really assisting older adults and kind of showing that support that I feel that wasn't there uh, in the initial news and information about what COVID-19 was. I think the initial news kind of pit generations against each other and kind of was like, well, it's acceptable for older adults to kind of run their course, or it's acceptable to have the economy continue because older adults aren't viewed as a valuable part of the fabric of our nation. um, and you might have seen like images on the media of those spring breakers versus the older adults who are in the home, and it kind of it kind of presented this ageist view of what an older adult is, and who we're trying to protect as a nation, right? Dr. Fauci is 79 years old, and he's on the TV every day, providing us with valuable information and letting us know, what it really means to protect not just an older adult or someone who's immunocompromised, but everyone. And then as the weeks has rolled on, we're starting to see that it has impacted not only just the older population, but young and old alike. And I think the resounding chord that says, we're all in this together, kind of, you know, is bringing us back to a place where we're valuing everyone contributing, not just, oh, well, it's only affecting these individuals.
Right, and it's, I think from the latest data that I saw here in New York City, the rate of infection among 18 to 49-year-olds is the highest proportion of infections reported in New York City. So that actually speaks against what the initial narrative was. You're absolutely right. And, we went through this arc of, there was a 2-week stretch where it was presumed that anybody over the age of 65 was just grist for the mill. And, you still, and I would imagine that you're countering those ideas, because that would be something that I think a lot of older people, especially in isolation, would internalize very quickly. And they might feel that they had more of a burden to kind of justify their existence and justify their survival in a way that a lot of other demographic groups in the country were not being discussed. It was just, like you said, it was that extreme case of the spring break, because of the timing when all of the dominoes started to really fall down. And then the idea that the most vulnerable would always be people over 60. And for the first few weeks in New York City, I did see a big discrepancy. I saw a lot of seniors, or not seniors, but a lot of older people uh, out in the streets and going to stores and kind of just going about their day-to-day business. As retirees, they've got that little route that they take through the neighborhood, where they go for their coffee, and then they go to the barber shop, and then they go to
McDonald's.
uh, or McDonald's and have their afternoon
Okay.
coffee and their snack. Exactly. And they go to the park to play dominoes. And, I still saw those little migrations happening. And I think a big part of that was because the national narrative was that these people were expendable. And so they thought, well, I've got nothing to live for, I've got nothing to lose, I might as well get out there. And I think there could have been a lot more, we'll all reflect on this in a few years. The scholarship that's going to come out of this is going to be remarkable. But going back to the provision of service and how you were, this discussion about obvious, the digital divide, we know we've been talking about this for a decade in librarianship. We know that it's real. But this instance really showcased the digital divide on our side of the desk. And I know, Lyman, you mentioned that there was a scramble in the first few days to make sure that essential staff had the technology to provide services. So what do you think about the response that this assumption, right? It's got two sides: the assumption that anybody over the age of 50 will somehow just know how to access these technologies, and
Right.
then B, anybody employed by an information center will also automatically know how to provide these services. So what steps have you taken? Have you drummed up training with your staff? What steps have you taken to mitigate the staff end of the digital divide?
So, on the staff end, we have had regular webinars system wide with Brooklyn Public on really a lot of the Zoom technology for staff to attend. And also, we've had a lot of trainings on ebooks and the possibility of helping patrons access that. Um, we also basically have our IT department is actually still available. All I have to do is pick up the phone. They are still working for us as well. So staff has access Monday through Friday during regular work time to call if something comes up in helping a patron through the laptop they've been provided.
Yeah, you mentioned the digital divide with staff. I too, I mean, I'm savvy with technology, but with Zoom, once the Zoom bombing happened and I saw it, I'm also a teacher. Once the Zoom bombing happened in one of my class, I was like, whoa, what's happening here? But as Lyman mentioned, like we had foster a Slack network, so we're all on Slack, Brooklyn Public Library, and so there's various channels to support. There's a self-care channel, there's a Corona channel, the IT department channel, an older adults channel. So whatever your interests are, or whatever you need support in, you kind of join one of those channels and you provide information. So there's a lot of cross collaboration and information sharing within Brooklyn Public Library to help staff feel a little bit more comfortable during the whole pandemic. I mean, Brooklyn Public Library literally went to a virtual library starting March 16th. So it was kind of like new for everyone. And it's not like we didn't tout the resources we already had. But as far as the virtual programming, getting the children's librarian on board with doing these Facebooks, live events, and then having the adult librarians on board and kind of providing resume reviews, reaching out to older adults. It really took like somebody saying, you know what, we need a channel for this, or which limits some of the emails, the organizational emails, because a lot of our union staff are at home, but it really touted our cross collaborative opportunities utilizing Slack and kind of instant messaging and getting some of the information out there relatively quickly.
And was that Slack network already in place before the
Mhm.
shutdown? Okay, great. So
Literally
you
kind of
already had,
like, yeah, but it was like
Yeah.
somebody maybe probably like a year before, and it was really slow. But it was like as soon as the shutdown happened, the entire staff members just got on it. Like it was just like the entire institution is now on Slack. That was like
Yeah.
something that we always wanted. So that was quite funny, but
Yeah.
quite
yeah, I think that's
necessary.
across the board. We had the same thing at St. John's where our program is completely online. And as you know, every university in the country flipped into the online model. So there was a discussion about transitioning everybody into online and how quickly we were able to get that going. But it was a real crisis. We went from something like 10% penetration of online courses to 100% of all courses being delivered online. So that was a scramble, and the learning curve is steep, with a lot of these technologies. But you were already in place, so you already had a working model, which is putting you ahead of the curve for a lot of other institutions, I think. Especially your institution is massive, and I've kind of always monitored the Tri-Li as a logistical operation. They're massive with so many different moving parts, and for you to have this kind of secondary communication channel that then becomes the primary communication channel is a very interesting transition. Speaking of transitions, what do you think, Lyman? What are some of the lessons? I know that you're still learning, and it took you
Mhm.
a few weeks to get your virtual programming up and running. But in terms of communication, logistics, operations, what are some of the things that you're picking up on that you may carry with you back into the building?
So let's start with staff first. I think you have to decide amongst your immediate department. Are we going to do Slack? Are we going to do email? Are we going to do the phone? Are we going to do text? I think the first thing you have to establish with your own direct staff is what's going to be our communication, because there are so many options out there. As far as the patrons go, the first thing I'm currently trying to actually start um, older adult Zoom instruction, trying to figure out somehow to give patrons um, instruction on Zoom itself, so that for the future, if this continues, we'll have more patrons that can enjoy our services and our educational opportunities. And then I think We have to not just think about access that I mentioned, but I think once we get back into the physical brick and mortar structures, we're going to have to think about um, are we going to how are we going to approach the seniors to come? Are they going to be afraid of coming back to the library? Are other patrons going to be afraid of them coming to the library? Um, I think we're going to have to shift our whole perspective on how we're going to reach out to our older adults just to get them back to the institution, really. So I think it's going to take a lot of rethinking the wheel and brainstorming just to think about how we're going to have the actual older adult patrons back in the building.
That's
Yeah,
an
with our
interesting.
partners. Oh, sorry.
No, no, I'm saying that's an interesting consideration. I hadn't given that any thought, but go ahead, Tina.
With our partners, one of the lessons learned is we literally had community boards. All the Brooklyn Community Board members came in and they had a presentation of what virtual programming at Brooklyn Public Library looks like. And so prior to this, everyone would come in person. It would be like one big event trying to get all, I forgot the amount, but at least 40 people in there representing Community Board 14, 3, et cetera, et cetera. And so we had them all there, and it only took an hour to just kind of present what the library is doing. From the resume career to what we're doing with older adult services, and people had an opportunity to kind of see the library in a new way. I think that's an excellent way moving forward to kind of touch base with our partners. Like rather than let's have this big meeting, we can just set up a Zoom conference
Mm.
and just give them real time updates of what the library is doing for particular populations or whatever area that they kind of are concerned with, if as far as our resources are concerned.
Right, I think the pendulum has swung back. We went from the period of, oh, this meeting should have been an email to, oh, maybe this meeting should just be a Zoom. So, we'll probably get back to a more streamlined. But I think, yeah, for public meetings, Zoom should definitely be an option. And as I've said, being in an online program and making sure that all of our events are synchronous with a recording posted to a central location. I mean, these are just workflows that I've been engaged in for 5 years now. And a little bit goes a long way, and having a synchronous, even if it's a synchronous meeting but there's a Zoom channel happening in the background and that's being monitored and people can ask questions and engage, I think that meeting is a lot more impactful. And again, it goes to the ease of access. Those that can online will, and those that can only do it in person should have the opportunity also. So that's a great model. So let's open it up to Q&A. Anybody who wants to contribute a question, feel free to drop it into chat. I'm going to start with the first one that's already in there. Quote, older patrons often struggle with technology. Have you had to write instruction to assist them to use utilities like Zoom, databases, etc.?
No, not yet, and that's why I mentioned that I am trying to work on something that would have Zoom instruction. The good thing, though, about what we've been doing is just trying to think of things that have a basic telephone aspect to it. And even with Zoom, you can just select that alternative as well. Um,
Yeah, and one of the things is that we have on staff electronic librarians, or resource librarians, who kind of are posting a lot of that content onto our website. So most of it is kind of redirecting the patrons to where they can find that information of how to like utilize the Zoom or how to like enlarge, use a Kindle, use a tablet. Like they're all in kind of like the same location about learning on the website. So, you know, can we make it more in large print? That's easy, but we're assuming that if they can access it any parts of the website, then they would be able to kind of adjust the fonts for anyone who might have visual impairments or the color contrast depending on what device they're personally using.
Yeah, I had a very interesting issue. This was about 10 years ago when I was working at a public library in Nassau County. And it was the summer, no, it wasn't the summer, it was the winter of, I think, 2009 or 10. And we were having a discussion about ebooks. And this was, Amazon was on the verge of signing a license with Overdrive. And Christmas was coming up, Hanukkah was coming up, and I went to the director of the library and I said, this is going to be the Christmas of the Kindle, and this is going to be the Hanukkah of the Kindle, and we have to really start talking about our ebook collection and about what digital services we offer to our patrons. And there was one librarian who was, I'll call her a veteran librarian. She had been in the career, she'd been in the field for 40 years before I was born, and she became my number one advocate. She became the number one evangelist for e-readers in the library because she said she suffered from macular degeneration. She was losing her vision. And rather than wait for the New York Times bestseller lists and all of the months that it takes for a publisher to decide to offer a large print version, she could download the ebook and change the font on her device, change the size of the font on her device. And so when I asked, would you volunteer? Would you sit in the lobby of the library and help people learn their devices? She very surprisingly said, you know what, I'm 80 years old and I'm more than happy to sit here and teach people how to use mobile devices to access ebooks. And she was our star for that entire initiative, that entire holiday season. She demonstrated to hundreds of patrons how to use their mobile device to access ebooks from our collection. So, that kind of ingenuity and accessibility concerns, it's really fun when you stumble upon a solution that's as surprising as having a veteran librarian step up. So I think this is what your library probably looks like now, right? This is the info commons at Central.
Very empty, very accurate.
Very empty. But yeah, I just want to bring it back to that discussion of ageism, and I think this is something that we all have to be aware of right now, just by nature of technology and the myth of the digital native. I think a lot of libraries are focusing on providing services to younger users, primarily school children in support of education, and school-age children all the way up through high school, college students, and we may tend to forget about the provision of services to the marginalized. And I've seen here in New York City, having the benefit of not overlapping, but definite large institutions with a global reach. It's taken the public libraries in New York City a few weeks to get even their foreign language program up and running virtually. And that might push some people into the margins, especially with the need for information in foreign languages related to this pandemic. So I think that's something that I would like all of us to be mindful of, is that it's not just older people, but it's also working people who are out of work. There's a lot of groups that are being marginalized by lack of information in the mainstream media, and it's our role as information professionals to make sure that we're reaching out to them and trying to meet their needs wherever they may be. I'll leave it open for questions. If anybody has anything they'd like to ask of our speakers, I'll just remind you of who they are. We're hearing from Lyman Claiborne and Taina Evans of Brooklyn Public Library. Well, thanks, folks. We'll post information to the DLIS blog, and everybody that was in the room today will get an email with an evaluation survey and some other information. Taina shared these two wonderful links of resources for helping older patrons, and the Oral Histories podcast produced by Brooke. So I'll share those with you all via email. Thank you again, Lyman and Taina, for taking time out of your day to talk to us today. And the recording will be posted, and you'll get a link to that as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, so before we end it, I just want to head into some DLIS housekeeping. The next talk in our Let's Talk series will be this Thursday, April 23rd, and we'll hear from instructional designers, accessibility librarians, and special ed educators about library services in support of special ed being delivered remotely. Then we're going to hear next week from reference librarians and their approach to remote reference, and then the series will end on April 30th with presentation from Dr. Vorbach, the DLIS Directors Forum. If you're in DLIS as a student, I just want to remind you that registration for summer and fall is currently open. And if you're trying to get out of DLIS with your MS-LIS and a May 2020 degree conferral, your ePortfolio is due by 5 p.m. tomorrow, April 22nd. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Stay safe, stay home, and hopefully we'll see each other real soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Connected.